Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here to talk about Windows Autopilot today. My name is Tanvir Ahmed. I'm a program manager on the Windows Autopilot team, and that means I get to work on kind of reimagining what Microsoft's take is on deployments going forward. And we do that through something we call Windows Autopilot. Many of you may have heard about it, but if you haven't, let's start by talking about what Windows Autopilot is. And we'll go over this really quickly before we start talking about all the amazing benefits that Windows Autopilot can bring to you and your deployment story going forward. If we looked at deployments today, typically the way it works is it involves a custom image. So organizations tend to take a golden image of Windows, put in versions of drivers that they think are okay, and bundled in certain applications, maybe some security baselines, maybe they join the domain, whatever it is. They package it all together. Then through either their OEM, a vendor, or in-house through Ghost or some sort of task sequence, they'll go ahead and deploy these images to their Windows machines. And as they do this, we as in our Autopilot team, we see a few fundamental problems to it. One, you've already purchased a device from your OEM that had a perfectly good image of Windows on it. Why would you then pay someone to reinstall Windows? Two, oftentimes the drivers that are included on these custom images, well, there's a few problems with those. One, you have to now take the responsibility yourself of making sure that they're the correct drivers, even though the OEM has already shipped the correct drivers for the most part in the device that shipped out of the OEM. But not only that, you now have to make sure that they're kept up to date. And how many devices are you going to keep track of in terms of drivers? This often leads to organizations having a handful of devices that are available in their catalog, maybe a few models of a certain OEM, and that kind of hinders employee choice of devices in the organization as well. And applications. You now have to maintain versions of applications in your images, and it just becomes a mess. So we looked at this and we thought, custom imaging seems very time-consuming, seems costly, and it seems like an out-of-date way of doing deployments of Windows, right? And we looked at kind of modernizing this and kind of reimagining what this would look like in today's world. So today, what we'd like to be able to do is grab a new device off the shelf, right? Have an employee take off that shrink wrap, get that new car smell type of experience, right? You get your brand new shiny laptop, you unbox it for the first time. There's no fingerprints from IT who handled it, or the 6 other people that touched the device before it got to the end user. They unshrink wrap the brand new device. They turn it on for the first time. It has the original image that was on that machine from the OEM manufacturing floor, and the machine deploys itself. And by the time you land on the desktop, you get the exact same end state as you would have had you done custom imaging. Meaning your background is there. If you're using OneDrive or something of the equivalent, all of your files are backed up and are already present. All of your applications are there. Your security baselines are on the machine. And to us, this is a much better experience because one, now you can offer all sorts of devices to your end users. Right? You're no longer limited to certain models because you don't have to take the responsibility of figuring out which drivers go into which image. You just choose which models in the OEM catalog you want to deploy, and that's it. End users select the device, they come shipped directly to them or their office, they unbox it, press power on, connect to the internet, and it's deployed. And for us, we look at that and we look at the rest of a device's life cycle and we call that Windows Autopilot, right? Now, many of you may think that my team focuses on the couple of blue setup screens that happen at the beginning of Windows. And while that's true, right, and I will talk a lot about the number of improvements that we've made to that experience, what's also true is our relationships with partners throughout the process of a device's lifecycle. And what that means is we work very closely with resellers, OEMs, et cetera, to make sure that that procurement process is as easy as possible for our customers. What that means is you should be able to go to an OEM or reseller and purchase a device that's already registered into Autopilot so that it's just ready to use in your organization. From the deployment standpoint, these are the blue screens in the beginning of Ubi. We are making sure that there's as few clicks as possible necessary to set up machines once they get to that state. Our team's philosophy is that every time a user is presented with an opportunity to click something in the UI, that's a potential area where you can get a support ticket, because an end user is going to click the wrong thing inevitably. Once this setup flow is complete, we get the device into a business-ready state. And what business-ready for us means is that all of your line of business applications are on that machine, all of your security policies are on that machine, and it's now ready for productivity, for productive use. From here, there's ongoing management and lifecycle of the device, and at some point, there's retirement, whether you want to refurbish that machine, you want to sell it off, whatever you'd like to do with that machine. If it's no longer needed by your organization, we've thought through a process to make sure that that unregistration process is seamless as well. And some point along the line, if your devices are experiencing troubleshooting type of scenarios where it's not quite working, we offer autopilot reset scenarios where with the click of a remote action through Intune, we're able to revert your device back into the initial business-ready state of that machine in a very short amount of time. So we look at all of these scenarios and all of these different areas of a device's lifecycle, and we come together and call that Windows Autopilot. Now, with the exception of the Autopilot reset scenario, we'll focus on the rest of those steps in today's talk. So to recap, we look at just the transformation of a Windows 10 PC. Instead of re-imaging the machine, we look at this, right? You take the original OEM version of the OS that ships with the Windows machine. You add on top of that your software, your settings, your updates, your firmware settings, your features, your user data, and now you have a device that's ready for productive use. Now, instead of imaging a machine and putting this all on here, we see there's more value in taking the original Windows image and transforming that to make sure that it's ready for productive use in your organization. Now, to use devices with Windows Autopilot, there's 3 general steps that you need to follow. The first step is to register devices into Windows Autopilot. Once devices are registered into Windows Autopilot, what this means is you've, as an organization, now taken claim and taken ownership of these devices. Now, anytime a device starting in Windows 10 1703, anytime a device boots and connects to the internet for the first time, it will automatically reach out to our Autopilot services and see if it's registered or belongs to a certain organization. If it is, that machine would automatically guide end users to a deployment path that joins the device into your organization. So that's what it means to register devices, and we'll go into that in a bit. The second step is to assign an Autopilot profile to these devices. And what an Autopilot profile is just a bundle of configurations that help dictate what that out-of-box experience looks like. Whether you'd like to have that first user be an admin or a standard user on that machine, whether you'd like the user to accept the EULA or if you'd like to do it on their behalf, and things along those lines. And finally, just send the device off to the end user. The onus is on the end user to now boot the device and just have it deploy. If you're looking to administer Windows Autopilot, today there are a number of portals that are available to do this. Of these, we recommend using the Microsoft Intune portal for registering devices, creating and assigning profiles, and just ongoing management of Autopilot devices. You do have the opportunity to use the other portals such as Store for Business, Partner Center, or 365 for Business. But the full feature set of what's available through Autopilot today is really available through Microsoft Intune. And so that's the one we recommend our enterprise customers and education customers to be using. So, step 1, registration of devices. There are a number of ways to do this. Let's start by talking about new devices. Now, if you go to our website, you'll see a list of several OEMs on our page. You'll see Dell, HP, Lenovo, Surface, Toshiba, Panasonic, Acer. And what these OEMs, and the reason why they're listed as participating devices, isn't because they're the only hardware models that are capable of running Autopilot. It's because we've worked closely with these OEMs such that you're now able to order devices from these OEMs and have the OEM automatically register the device into your organization prior to shipping out that device. So what that means is when you receive a device from, I'll just randomly say Lenovo, if you receive a device from Lenovo, what that means is that device is already registered to your organization. So all you have to do now is create and assign a profile and boot the device. You don't have to do any extra steps to make sure that device is registered against your organization in Autopilot. OEMs and distributors and resellers all have a way to make that process easy for you. Many of you may be familiar with the PowerShell script that's available to extract the hardware hash from a device to then register that device into Autopilot. That's a very manual step, and we don't anticipate that being the long-term strategy for an enterprise customer to have to register all of their devices into Intune or into Autopilot. OEMs, VARs, distributors all have ways to automatically add devices on your behalf into your organization. Typically, the way this works is the partner or OEM will have to request access into your tenant. We've documented what that process looks like, but ultimately what all that enables that partner to do is now add devices and remove devices that they've added into your organization. They're unable to do anything else unless you give them permission to do more. And so what happened here is an OEM, prior to shipping out the device, will go ahead and add that device into your tenant. They could be able to tag that device with a specified label. So if you'd like to say that, these 100 devices are going to location 1 in Amsterdam versus location 2 in Amsterdam, you can tag those devices that way so that you can see the difference when you look at your flat list of devices in Azure or Intune. And that's really it. If you have existing devices that are already in your estate and you'd like to register them into Autopilot, one easy way to do that we've announced in 1809 is through the use of a new setting that's available in the Autopilot profile. So in Intune, when you go to create a new Autopilot profile, one of the options you'll see is this option that says, by default, this profile can only be applied, to convert all targeted devices to Autopilot. And what happens when you check this switch, or you flip this switch, is now the next time Intune syncs with any machine that isn't already registered into Autopilot, Intune will automatically register that device against Autopilot. And so what that means is for those existing devices, if down the road you'd like to reset the device or repurpose the machine, the next time it goes through the out-of-box experience, it will go through an Autopilot experience that's customized or that's dictated by the profile that's assigned to it. So if you have existing Windows 10 devices, this is a very easy way to get those devices registered into Autopilot. If your devices are not yet enrolled into Intune, then our guidance is to enable co-management through SCCM or push the group policy for hybrid AD joined devices, which will automatically register those devices again with Intune. And at that point, you can use this Autopilot configuration to now auto-register those devices into Autopilot. Now, if either of those two options aren't suitable for you, then the fallback would be to use the PowerShell script that's available today. And this is a manual way of going ahead and registering devices into Autopilot. So you can use the PowerShell script that's available at that link. And what will happen is you have to run this script for every device you'd like to have registered. It'll generate a CSV file, and you can take that CSV file and upload it into any one of the portals that are available today. And what will happen is that device will be registered against your organization. So that kind of summarizes the different ways that you can go about registering these devices into Autopilot so that they show up in your list of devices and are marked as owned by your organization. The next step is to create and assign a profile. Now to do this, we'll go over the Intune UI for this, but you go into the deployment profile area of Intune and you can configure an Autopilot profile for any of your devices that are registered through Autopilot. And the type of things you can configure here, one, the deployment mode. So there are two flavors of Autopilot today from a deployment mode standpoint. One mode requires user authentication in UBI. And what that means is an end user is going to be prompted for user credentials during the out-of-box experience. The other experience that we offer today is the self-deploying mode capability. With that capability, you do not need any user credentials in the out-of-box experience. However, we do require those devices have a physical TPM 2.0 chip in that machine. And we'll go over each of those deployment modes in a bit. Aside from that deployment mode, you can select whether you'd like that device to join Azure Active Directory or on-prem hybrid Azure Active Directory. And you can also configure things like whether the end user should have to accept the EULA, or if you'd like to accept the EULA on the user's behalf, device rename capabilities, whether you'd like the user to have the ability to create a local account and opt out of Autopilot, and whether you'd like that user to be standard or administrator. One comment I would add around the device naming capabilities is today, the feature set is limited to just injecting either a random number or a serial number into the device name template. We have already heard feedback from our customers, and we're making it extensible so that you'd be able to plug in your own REST API or whatever endpoint you'd like to now customize that name to exactly the naming templates that are available in your organization. So in summary, we're going to open that up to Graph APIs so that you can now configure what device names will be for any device that is going to go through Autopilot. So once that profile is created, the second step is really to now take that profile and assign it to your devices in your estate. The easiest way to do that is to create a dynamic group in AAD. So if you have existing Windows 10 devices, right, an AAD object is already created for every Autopilot device that's registered in your tenant. Once those objects are there, you can go and create a dynamic group with several types of rules to now ensure that those machine objects are in a group so you can target the Autopilot profiles to them. Options that we provide, you can create a dynamic group based off of a ZTD ID property, which basically every AAD object that's an Autopilot object has a ZTD ID attribute on it. So you should be able to create a dynamic group that filters on whether a device or an object has that property. You can also filter by purchase order ID if you know which purchase order ID is associated with groups of devices, or through order IDs or device tags, which are basically optional fields that can be used to tag individual devices or groups of devices if you'd like to distinguish between, I don't know, location 1, location 2, or type of info worker, that type of scenario. And to look at this, basically, you can go into AAD, create a new group, create a new security group, for all Autopilot devices. And in a few slides, you'll see I'll list out all of the requirements and all of our documentation links. In there, you'll see all of, you'll see the advanced rules and all of our guidance. And this and our suggestions for how to set up your dynamic groups are all listed there. So here you can see, basically we've created a dynamic group with the rule of having all devices that have a ZTD ID attribute. And what's happened is that resolves to every device that's registered into Autopilot against your organization. So now that you have this group, you can now target that Autopilot profile to this group. Now every machine, as it goes through UBI, will get this Autopilot profile, which is what you'll see here in assigning profile. But rather than do that, you can just go through here really quickly. So this is the Intune portal. We'll go into device enrollment and Windows enrollment. And on the bottom of this page, you'll see the Windows Autopilot deployment program. The first option here is for deployment profiles. When you click deployment profiles, you'll see a list of your profiles that you've already created. But for the purposes of this, impromptu demo. We'll create a profile and call it very originally Demo Ignite. This is the option I was talking about earlier. So if you enable this switch, what will happen is every device that is targeted with this profile, if it's not already registered into Autopilot, it will automatically register itself against Autopilot. So you can select this option. For deployment mode, we can choose user-driven, which is the one that requires user authentication in the out-of-box experience, or we could have chosen self-deploying mode. And for join to AAD as, we can choose Azure Active Directory or Hybrid Azure Active Directory. Choose Azure Active Directory, and here you can see the various options that you can have for setting up that profile. Separately, if you look one option below, you see a list of devices. Here you'll see all of the devices registered against your organization listed here. And you can filter through those and also sort through whatever it is that you like to do here. Here you also see a summary of which deployment groups your devices belong to and which profiles are assigned to that device. One comment I'll make around this, we have heard feedback around the performance issues and just certain lacks of capabilities on that UI for management of devices in Autopilot in the Intune portal. And what I'll say about that is we've heard your feedback and we're addressing it very shortly. My guess, maybe in a month or so, but we are making vast improvements such that performance is faster, there's less latency delays, and there's better improvement, better experiences around filtering and sorting through devices and just managing devices, because we understand it's very slow to have to look through like 20 devices at a time, for example. So if you look at the registering devices and we look at everything as a whole, here's a quick summary slide. You add a device to the Autopilot deployment service. The device syncs from Autopilot deployment service to Intune. This can happen either manually if you trigger it through the portal, or every 12 hours, or whatever cadence we have in our backend system. Once the device is registered into Autopilot, something else that happens at the same time, anytime a device is registered into Autopilot, automatically an AAD object is pre-created for that machine. That object is pre-created such that you have something in AAD already where you can create a dynamic group and start targeting policies to that machine. We'd like you to be able to kind of pre-process a lot of that information. So what happens is as soon as a device is registered into Autopilot, an AAD object is already pre-created for that machine. So with that pre-created object, which has attributes like the ZTD ID, order ID, and the purchase order ID, you can create AAD dynamic groups to include those devices in those groups, and then you can create and assign an Autopilot profile into those groups. And that's all of the background that you need to do to kind of set up those devices for Autopilot. Just a quick piece of trivia if anyone's wondering. ZTD ID is coming from the original code name for Autopilot, where we used to call it zero-touch deployment. So that's where ZTD comes from. You might see randomly ZTD show up all over the place for Autopilot if you're looking at the internal attributes and things, and that's where it's coming from. All right, so deployment. So let's go through the fun stuff. So Windows Autopilot overview looks like this. So a hardware vendor takes your device IDs and uploads them into the Windows Autopilot service. In the Windows Autopilot service, the devices sync to Intune. The IT admins configure a profile, again, put it into Intune. Intune syncs the Autopilot profiles to the Windows Autopilot service. The hardware vendor, either then or simultaneously, ships the device to the employee. The employee unboxes the device, and when the device unboxes, every device since 1703, as it's going through the out-of-box experience, as soon as it connects to the internet, talks to the Windows Autopilot service. And so the Windows Autopilot service will go ahead and guide that device down a streamlined Autopilot flow so that the end user has a seamless experience. In terms of licensing, there's a lot of text on this page, but I'll try to simplify it as much as I can. One of the following of these subscriptions is required for Windows Autopilot. So either Microsoft 365 Business, Microsoft 365 F1, any academic licenses, Enterprise E3 or E5. Similarly, if you have EMS, E3, E5 are required. And by required, what's really required here, and I'll talk about this, purely from a licensing standpoint, the main things you need is a Pro license for Windows 10, because it's not available on Home. It's only available on Pro and above. That's one. Two, we very strongly recommend AAD P1 or equivalent, because we don't see scenarios where enterprise customers are deploying AAD without also registering those devices into MDM. The capability to auto-enroll devices into MDM when they're joined to Azure is a P1 capability, which is why you'll see as a common theme, we recommend having any one of these licenses because they include AAD P1. For whatever reason, if you choose not to have an MDM, you do not require AAD P1. Similarly, when we look at management, we are including Intune as the offering for the MDM management. That's why if you look at any of these offerings, they include an Intune license, and that's why we're recommending you have an Intune license. But if you're going strictly off the technical requirements, then really you just need an AAD license that allows you to join devices into AAD and a Windows 10 Pro license. Any of these subscriptions include those licenses, which is why we recommend that you have any one of these when we talk about licensing requirements. In terms of one-time configuration tasks, I'll leave this as a slide that you can have later. But basically, there are one-time configurations that need to happen at a tenant level to configure and prep your devices for Autopilot going forward. They include things like setting up automatic MDM enrollment, configuring company branding, enabling the enrollment status page, ensuring users can enroll into Intune by assigning licenses, things like that. We've documented all of this in that link below. So if you go to that link below, it should go through step by step all of the different things that you need to configure as a one-time thing to get your tenant set up for Autopilot. The enrollment status page is a feature that we rolled out in 1703. And what it is, it's a way for Autopilot to effectively lock the end user in the out-of-box experience until all of the required applications, network profiles, certificates, and security policies arrive on the machine. So this ensures that no end user goes to the desktop before your security software, for example, is on that machine, right? The way to turn this feature on, I'll go back quickly since I have the Intune portal open. Whoops. If you go in the Windows enrollment blade and you scroll to the top, you'll see the enrollment status page available here. And if you go through the enrollment status page, you'll see the different options. You'll see the different options that are available. You can choose to have that page be blocking in behavior, meaning users are blocked on that page until all of the required applications and policies are on that machine. You can choose timeouts so that if it takes too long, users can time out and error out, and you can also choose your remediation paths, whether you'd like the user to be able to collect logs, reset the device, continue anyway, and just audit it later, things along those lines. But we recommend that you turn on the enrollment status page because it creates a better user experience, because now instead of landing on the desktop and wondering when Office is going to be there or getting a support ticket saying that, hey, I have Outlook on my machine, but it's not ready because conditional access isn't set up, instead of avoiding all of that headache, instead take the hit and have users sit here while the Office and all of your security policies and conditional access is all ready to go, so that when the user lands on the desktop on minute 0, they can click Outlook, they can go in, they can try to look at their email, and everything's ready. Okay, so let's talk about scenarios. So Windows Autopilot scenarios, there's 4 key ones that I'd like to talk about today. One is user-driven mode with Azure Active Directory. This is our original scenario that we've had since 1709, and this scenario is basically requiring users to present credentials in the out-of-box experience. The end state is an Azure Active Directory joined machine that is also enrolled into MDM. Optionally, if you'd like to have SCCM in there, you can also include SCCM as part of co-management. The second one is self-deploying mode. This is a scenario that we introduced in 1809. This scenario does not require any user credentials in the out-of-box experience. You simply boot the machine, you connect it to Ethernet or a network connection, and it requires 0 clicks. It authenticates itself, enrolls against your organization, and lands in either shared desktop mode if you have multiple users or shared devices. Sorry. It's optimal for use cases where it's a shared device, where multiple users can sign in, or kiosk type scenarios where you'd like to use it as like a lobby machine or check-in machine, something like that. The third one is user-driven mode with Hybrid Azure AD. This scenario is the one where, again, similar to the first one, users are prompted for user credentials in the out-of-box experience. However, the end state here is a device that is joined to your on-prem AD and also has a registration into Azure and is also managed either through Intune solely or co-management, so Intune and SCCM. And lastly, we have Autopilot for existing devices, which is mainly useful for customers still on Windows 7 as they're looking to migrate over to Windows 10. The key problem today is that if registering Autopilot devices requires that that machine be on Windows 10 1703 and later, because the hardware hash that we extract from the machine requires Windows 10 1703 or later. It looks at a lot of the attributes which aren't available prior to that. So if you have Windows 7 machines, you're unable to register those into Autopilot, for example. This feature, Windows Autopilot for existing devices, allows you to take those Windows 7 machines and then deploy them as they go into Windows 10 through Autopilot, even if you haven't registered those devices into Autopilot. And we can talk about that in a bit. So the first one, user-driven deployment with Azure AD. So let's talk very quickly about this. First couple of things. One, these are usually one-to-one type of devices. The Autopilot scenario should be gone through by the end user. The user authenticates with Azure AD at the start of the flow, and you have a choice as an IT admin to choose whether that user is going to be a standard or an admin. Basically, the standard deployment profile settings that I've shown and talked about previously. And what this flow looks like is here. So Windows 10 machine boots up for the first time. You select the region, the keyboard, the second keyboard. If you have Ethernet, the device keeps going. If you don't have Ethernet, you have to connect to Wi-Fi. The next step, the user sees a customized branded experience where they sign in to Azure AD. If you had multi-factor authentication set up, they would have been prompted for MFA there. The next thing they see is the enrollment status page. On this enrollment status page, all the required configurations and apps and everything is coming down to the machine. The user is here waiting while that's happening. Once this process completes, you see the standard, we're getting ready for you, the flashing lights. We like to call it this the disco. So we wait for the disco to finish. Once it's done, you see the enrollment status page again. The reason you see the enrollment status page twice is because the first time you see it, there is no user profile that's created on the machine. So everything that we are syncing and configuring at that stage is anything that's targeted to the device and at a system level. Once the flashing lights completes, what's really happening under the covers is we're creating the user profile and signing into that profile. So the second time you see the enrollment status page, we're really configuring all of the user targeted settings to that machine. So any like user VPN, user configurations, things of that nature. Here, now that we're on the device, on the desktop, you can see that OneDrive is not only installed, but all your files for OneDrive are already preloaded on the machine, and it's all set up and ready to go. So as an end user, as soon as I land on the desktop, I can just start getting to work. We've included one of these summary slides. I won't go through all of them, but basically they just talk about the prerequisites that you need. I'll highlight some of the key attributes of each feature. Basically, for user-driven mode for AAD, the key prerequisites here are Windows 10 1703. Well, it's 1703 with a July patch, but then there's improvements in 1709. Basically, we'd like you to use 1709 if you use this scenario. Again, the same licensing requirements that we mentioned earlier. The steps for this are pretty straightforward. Just go through the steps I mentioned earlier in the talk, and you should be ready to go for this workflow. For user-driven Hybrid Azure AD join, this scenario is a little bit different. So the way this works is as the employee is unboxing the device and it's going through the Autopilot flow, the hardware ID is sent up to the Windows Autopilot deployment service, and Autopilot responds back with a Autopilot profile. This Autopilot profile tells the device that it needs to join Hybrid Azure AD instead of pure AAD. So the device enrolls into Intune. Intune uses a new connector to now talk to your on-prem DC. What it does through this connector is it's talking to the DC, it's pre-creating a computer object on your on-prem DC, it's generating what's known as an offline domain join blob, and it's taking that blob, piping it back through the connector, and sending it down to the machine. So it's taking this offline domain join blob and applying it on your device as it's going through Ubi. And what this means is your device is now joined to your domain, because that offline domain join blob is effectively a machine level credential that allows you to join your domain. Once that's there, we go to the controversial part of this scenario, which is you need to be on a network that requires CorpNet connectivity for this scenario to work. This is the only Autopilot scenario that has a network requirement of that nature. And what this means is your device must be on a network that's connected to or that has line of sight to your on-prem DC. Once that's there, an end user will be able to sign in using their domain credentials, and you'll receive group policies and SCCM or whatever else you have from a management standpoint through the existing channels that you have today. We are already well aware of overwhelming customer feedback to request a remote scenario and remote capabilities where you're able to do this scenario from anywhere. And although I don't have an update today, just know that we are actively working on it, and hopefully we're targeting something by next release. From a demo perspective, the Hybrid Azure AD join scenario looks awfully close to the first scenario, which is user-driven mode with pure Azure Active Directory. And you'll see this here. So when you start the device for the first time, you're going through the Autobox experience, you select your region, you select the keyboard, the secondary keyboard. And again, in this case, because we're connected on a VM, you don't see any network selection because we're just using the internet from the host machine. But you connect to a network that has line of sight to your DC. You sign in to AAD. Even though you're signing into AAD, it's not joining AAD. It's simply getting an auth token from AAD and using that auth token to enroll into Intune. So in this stage, the device is enrolled into Intune. Intune is now behind the scenes using the connector to talk to your on-prem DC and pipe down an offline domain join blob. Once that blob reaches the machine, you'll see the device say that it needs to reboot so that it can change the computer name to match whatever was pre-created on the on-prem DC. And once that happens, the device will be renamed. It'll be joined to the domain. You'll see the enrollment status page where all of the configurations will come down to the machine and things will be fine. The other piece that we keep getting asked about for this scenario, right now you still have the preview tags listed all over the scenario. We're expecting to have those preview tags removed probably within a month. So here on the Windows sign-in page, you sign in using your domain credentials. And once you sign in, that's really it. You see the disco, you're on the desktop, and you're ready to go. Prerequisites, you need to be on Windows 10 1809. There's one extra key step, which is you need to set up the ODJ connector in Intune prior to running this scenario. All of these steps are documented if you search for search for Windows Autopilot Hybrid Azure AD. There's a detailed document which outlines how to install the connector, what permissions you need to enable, what licenses, things like that. Let's talk about self-deploying mode. So self-deploying mode was our solution when we thought about how would you use Autopilot to deploy these types of scenarios. So like digital signage, single app kiosk, shared PCs, scenarios where there isn't necessarily a one-to-one connection between that machine and an end user. And what that means is, there's no defined user to auth or set up that machine. So imagine if it's like a kiosk, like who's going to authenticate into that machine to now join that machine to Azure Active Directory? It's not going to be me, because it's not going to be me who's going to be ending up using that machine. And it doesn't make sense for a technician who's setting up that machine to also have credentials into your organization. So we needed a solution that didn't require any sort of user authentication. And the other piece that we had to work around was the fact that these types of devices typically don't have peripherals. So you don't generally have keyboards or mice or any of these types of things to input data into those machines. And they typically involve walk-up and use scenarios. What this means is they're typically set up as kiosks, or they're typically first-line worker type of scenarios where you have a stock of machines, a user pulls a machine off the top, signs in, and they do whatever their task is, and they put it back on the pile. For these types of machines, it's very easy for us to kind of need a flow that doesn't require user credentials and just leaves the device in a state where it just can be immediately used whenever it needs to be used. So the way this process works, so you'll see a machine boot for the first time here. As it boots, the first thing you'll see is a branded experience that basically says, welcome to Contoso, we'll get you set up for work. Shortly after this, you'll see the enrollment status page immediately come in. Now, what's happening in this enrollment status page that's different from the user-driven models where you require user authentication is right now we're actually using this new device authentication type that we invented for 1809, which basically is taking the device's physical TPM 2.0 chip. It's running whole sets of attestation services against them to make sure that this TPM is exactly the TPM that we expect in that machine and that you have physical ownership of that TPM, et cetera. Once all of that checks out, we're able to now automatically register the device against AAD without requiring user credentials. Once that's there and everything else comes down to the machine, the device in this case is set up as a kiosk, so it goes directly into the kiosk application. Now, there were no user interactions required. You simply plug it in and you boot the device. In real world, if it's not sped up in a demo video, this takes around 3 minutes. And if you're thinking that's on Microsoft Wi-Fi, sure. If it's on my home Wi-Fi, which is much slower, then it's still 6 minutes. So it's very quick and easy to deploy devices this way. It's particularly easy to have this also used in that first-line worker type of scenario. So imagine instead of having to deploy into the kiosk application, it would just land you on the Windows sign-in page. Now, as a first-line worker, I just pull a device, sign in to Windows because they're all joined to Azure Active Directory, and now I can just immediately become productive. There's just last-mile configurations that are required for every end user. So things like any user certificates, any user apps that you may want to deploy. If you don't have anything along those lines, then, well, they're just productive, right? So that's self-deploying mode with Azure Active Directory. Again, the key differences here with the other scenarios is that the device must have a physical TPM 2.0 chip in it, and we require that it runs version 1809. And the reason I keep stressing a physical TPM 2.0 chip is because this will not work with VMs today. We are looking at an option where we allow you to evaluate the scenario with virtual TPMs, but that's not yet available, and it's in our roadmap. We don't have commitment of even releasing it. So there's self-deploying mode with Azure AD. Windows Autopilot for existing devices. When we came up with this scenario, the key thing we had in mind was this date here. So this date, for those of us procrastinators in the room, are folks who are on Windows 7 going to Windows 10. Now, I've mentioned this briefly previously, but the key challenge of moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10, well, there's a whole list, but from an Autopilot perspective, the key challenge here is that you're unable to harvest device IDs from a machine unless it's running Windows 10 1703 July update or later. So what that means is if you try to extract the hardware information from a Windows 7 machine, there's not going to be enough information there for the Autopilot service to now uniquely create a record and now uniquely identify that device globally, which presents a problem. Because what this means is as you upgrade your devices from Windows 7 to Windows 10, when it's on Windows 10 for the first time, unless you do all this extra homework to now re-register the device when it's on Windows 10 and then sysprep it back and do all this magic, it's not going to work with Autopilot, right? And obviously we want our customers to have a smooth experience with Autopilot for Windows 7 to 10. So what we've created is a flow that involves all of these different services, so Autopilot, OneDrive for Business, Intune, and System Center, and come up with a scenario that allows you to at least have a seamless deployment between Windows 7 and Windows 10. And what we saw was, well, upgrading the OS is just a piece of the overall problem. We also needed to solve the problem between just migration of user data from Windows 7 to Windows 10. And again, the key problem here for us that we needed to solve is that you're unable to harvest hashes in Windows 7, so you're unable to register Windows 7 devices into Autopilot. Now, if you're looking at migration of user data from Windows 7 to Windows 10, if you're changing your identity, for example, from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and on Windows 7 you have Azure Active Directory joined devices, you're unable to use tooling such as USMT because the user profiles in USMT won't map between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So because of that limitation, we're looking at things like OneDrive for Business and known folder migration. So we actually worked very closely with the OneDrive team to work through and release a group policy which allows you to automatically back up all of the files in your known folders into OneDrive so that when they appear on Windows 10 for the first time, all your files are already there. If you look at Autopilot for existing devices, the key step, as this plays in the background, the key step here is that we've introduced a JSON file which includes a stub of an Autopilot profile. This JSON file is included in the task sequence as you deploy a machine from Windows 7 to Windows 10. And what happens is as it's going and updating to Windows 10, that JSON file is just placed into a specific directory in the operating system. So when the device boots for the first time, it recognizes that it just got deployed through a task sequence. It reads the offline JSON file and it bootstraps itself in Ubi seamlessly so that to the end user, all they see is a seamless Autopilot profile, Autopilot scenario. They don't notice any hiccups knowing that the device wasn't pre-registered into Autopilot. They don't notice anything to see that the device wasn't pre-created, that there weren't policies assigned to it, etc. They see the standard Autopilot experience. So here the task sequence for deploying Windows 10 is still running. In this video, we'll speed through this. So around here, you see that we've booted into Windows 10 for the first time. At this stage, the SCCM agent is no longer on the machine, and the device just goes through Autopilot. So this is identical from an experience standpoint from what we saw with user-driven mode with Azure AD. It's the exact same experience. The user opts into AED, they get enrolled into Intune, they see the enrollment status page, they see the disco lights, they see the enrollment status page again, and they land on the desktop. Here, with known folder migration, you'll also see that when they land on the desktop, all of their files are already there because they've been backed up and re-put down on the machine through OneDrive for Business. So with this, you need Windows 10 1809. You need SCCM, or you need some tooling to be able to put that JSON file in the operating system as it's booting into Windows 10 for the first time. You need OneDrive for Business if you would like to leverage the known folder migration. Again, you can't use USMT because it won't map between Active Directory profiles and Azure Active Directory profiles unless you're doing other things to augment that scenario. Out-of-box ESMT doesn't do that today. And effectively, as you're using your task sequence to upgrade devices from Windows 7 to Windows 10, you just also include the JSON file that includes the Autopilot stub. We've also released documentation where there's a PowerShell script available which will help you generate that the JSON file. And that should be it. From here, the other thing we've seen customers do with this functionality is we've also seen customers use this scenario also for VMs. So one thing I'd point out for this scenario is that we frame the scenario under the Windows 7 to Windows 10 migration umbrella, but really the key technology here is that offline JSON file, which contains the stub of Autopilot, which our services are trained to read and understand, how that file got there and what to do when it sees that file. What that means is, let's say you're booting a VM for the first time. If you include that JSON file in the VM image, what will happen is as the VM boots and goes through Ubi for the first time, it'll actually pick up on that Autopilot profile and go through an Autopilot-like experience similar to this scenario here for Windows 7 to Windows 10. So we've seen customers leverage this scenario for VMs even though we didn't originally intend for it to go that way. And with the last couple of minutes I have, I'd like to talk a little bit about roadmap and what we're doing going forward. So what we've already announced, and I'll give more information than we did in Ignite in Orlando, is a couple of things. I think the biggest one that we're really excited about is Autopilot White Glove. Autopilot White Glove is our response to how you solve that problem of having to download gigabytes of data at the last mile. And what this means is we've invented a flow that doesn't involve the end user having to download gigabytes and gigabytes of data and also spend all that time waiting for installations and just wait while the the machine is being set up. The second piece is enhancements to the enrollment status page. So if you've deployed Win32 applications using the Intune management extension, you'll find that today they're not tracked on the enrollment status page. We've made changes to make sure that they are now tracked on the enrollment status page. So now, if you have a Win32 application that you're deploying, you can be assured that that application will be installed successfully before the user ever lands on the desktop if you choose to do that. Some other changes we made to the enrollment status page. Last time we talked in 1809, you didn't have the ability to target the enrollment status page to specific groups of users. Now you are able to target the enrollment status page to groups of users instead of making a tenant-wide setting. The other change is previously, the enrollment status page either tracked every application in your tenant or it tracked none of them. Now you have the option of choosing which applications are tracked on the enrollment status page, so you no longer have to wait for your entire app catalog while you're on that page. The third one is that we've removed Cortana, finally, from all Windows SKUs Pro and up, so you no longer have to hear Cortana's intro when you're deploying Windows machines. The last one that we didn't talk about last Ignite is self-updating Autopilot. So our team has done a lot of incredible work to isolate the Autopilot stack into just 3 or 4 DLLs instead of having it spread out across the operating system. What this means, and what we've heard from as feedback from customers, one of the key things I've heard is if I've released a new feature under Autopilot, let's say it's device naming capabilities, and I ask a customer, well, you can leverage device naming capabilities as soon as you upgrade your estate from 1703 to 1809. Customer looks at me like I'm crazy, because it's not as easy to deploy a brand new version of Windows every time you want to leverage a new Autopilot scenario. To address this, what we've done is we've split out the Autopilot stack. So starting in 1903, what this means is if we decide to release a new piece of Autopilot functionality, we'll be able to do it without you having to update the rest of Windows. So if we like to release changes to the enrollment status page, changes to the Hybrid Azure AD flow, changes to whatever it is that involves Autopilot, we'll be able to do it out of band. Autopilot will update itself in the out-of-box experience. It's a small payload. It's like 3 megabytes or so. And that's it. You don't have to update the rest of Windows. and it won't impact apps or anything else. It's all self-contained with just Autopilot. In the last few minutes, I'll just double-click on the first one and talk about White Glove. So what is Autopilot White Glove? Well, still don't have a final marketing name for it, but the idea here is we have some warehouse somewhere where devices are being processed for them to be released or handed off to your organization. Now, at this stage, well, first of all, this doesn't necessarily have to be an OEM or a VAR or a disti. It could also be in-house, right? So imagine anyone who is not the final recipient of that machine, someone can take this device off the shelf or unbox it or whatever it is. When you boot the device for the first time, there's going to be some special keyboard shortcut that you can type in at the beginning page of Ubi. And what this will do is it'll launch a special UI for Autopilot. So here you'll be able to select White Glove provisioning. Now from the tenant standpoint, you have to now enable your devices to be ready for Autopilot White Glove. And once it's ready, you'll see on this page, you'll see a summary of all the different attributes of this machine, which organization it's joined to or registered under, whether it's, what type of profile is assigned to it, whether it's enabled for White Glove, and if there's assigned user to it. So if you've specifically assigned this to someone in the organization. And you can scan the QR code to kind of show that information and also have shortcuts into configuring it or making that right. But the idea is once everything is ready and all seems in place, the technician in this case will be able to click on Provision Device on the bottom right. What this will do is it'll go directly into the enrollment status page. Now you'll see there's no region, language, keyboard, Wi-Fi. There's nothing in this streamlined flow of White Glove, and that's because we require you to have Ethernet connected to these machines. There's no region, there's no language, there's nothing. And there's no clicks beyond the keyboard shortcut and the click to start provisioning of the machine. Here, the device goes through a new flow here to register itself against your organization, to get all of the configurations targeted to this device through Intune or System Center or SCCM, and it gets the entire device ready, right? It installs all your applications, security baselines, whatever it is you'd like to do. And once it's complete, the provisioner sees a page like this, which summarizes how long the device took, whether it was successful or not, and the only option they have at this point is to click that button on the bottom right that says Reseal. What happens here is it runs a modified version of sysprep, which now puts the device back into the first page of Ubi. Now at this point, the device can be shipped off if it's an OEM or a distributor doing it. If you're doing it in-house, you can hand it off to the end user. But the idea is the end user, when they boot the device for the first time, they see the exact same Autopilot experience we've been talking about this whole session. The only difference here is they no longer have to wait all that extra time for their apps to download, for the policies to configure, the apps to install. They have a quick check to see if there's any deltas in configuration, and then they land on the desktop. It's a much smoother experience, and you may be wondering, well, isn't that the same as imaging? It's not, because you're not managing drivers, and you're also downloading everything live from an online source rather than having to package and maintain your images. So with that, I hope you enjoyed what we have ready for you and what's coming in store for Autopilot. We can't wait for you to try it out and modernize your deployment experiences. Thank you.